This week on Brian Ross Investigates, the mystery woman who once served as Jeffrey Epstein's pilot.
I think she's an extremely important witness.
But before she was a pilot, witnesses say she was a teenage sex slave for Epstein and then helped to recruit other young women for the multimillionaire sex predator who took his own life while awaiting trial.
Do you in the end have sympathy for her?
You know, it's a mixed, that's a mixed question. I have sympathy for her, yes.
Plus, growing concern about President Trump's claim that a COVID-19 vaccine will be available before the November election.
We'll produce a vaccine before the end of the year, or maybe even sooner.
We'll talk with a top public health official, Dr. Boris Lushniak. What's the latest? What's the truth? And this week's winners and losers in the media. See if you agree with the editors of Mediaite.
They choke, just like in a golf tournament, they miss a 3-foot.
You're not comparing it to golf.
From the Law&Crime Trial Network, this is Brian Ross Investigates.
Good evening and welcome. I'm Brian Ross, joined tonight, as always, by my colleague at the Law&Crime Network, Rhonda Schwartz. And Rhonda, we begin with someone described as a mystery woman in the case of Jeffrey Epstein, the multimillionaire sex predator. He took his own life while awaiting trial in New York, but the FBI investigation of his activities does continue, Rhonda.
That's right. And last July, the FBI arrested Epstein's close associate, Ghislaine Maxwell. She's being held in federal custody. She's pleaded not guilty to charges of child sex trafficking. But the FBI is continuing their investigation and looking at other close Epstein associates, including Prince Andrew, who, of course, has denied any allegations of sexual impropriety with minors.
And of course, the FBI is looking for important witnesses. One of them could be the woman by the name of Nadia Marchenko. She is a former pilot for Jeffrey Epstein, and we're going to learn a lot about her fascinating backstory from a journalist who's been covering this story, Christine Negroni, who is an aviation journalist who worked for the New York Times, was seen on ABC News, and has her own blog. Christine told us all about, when I talked to her earlier, the story of Nadia Marchenko. So who is Nadia Marchenko?
Well, Nadia Marchenko was one of the unindicted co-conspirators in the first criminal action brought against Jeffrey Epstein back in the mid-2000s. And she was, in the indictment, she was both victim of Jeffrey Epstein. She had, in the indictment, they called her a, quote, a sex slave of Jeffrey Epstein. But in the complaints filed by the young women in Palm Beach and West Palm Beach, she was an active participant in some of the sex acts perpetrated against them. So she's a complicated figure in the Jeffrey Epstein story, but she is also a long-standing figure in the Jeffrey Epstein story.
And now you are reporting that she's become quite the accomplished pilot.
Well, I don't know how accomplished she is as a pilot, but she certainly made a reputation as a celebrity pilot. So she got her pilot's license right around the time that Jeffrey Epstein was serving time the first time in Florida, and she went on to fairly quickly some considerably responsible jobs as a first officer or co-pilot on Jeffrey Epstein's airplanes, for example. And then when I met her in late 2013, she told me that she was flying an Embraer Phenom 300, which is a nice, expensive, high-powered jet that many business people use. And there are lots of documents that say that when the authorities wanted to question her, Jeffrey Epstein flew her out of the country so she could avoid being forced to testify. Well, once she became an unindicted co-conspirator, and once she was granted that sweeping immunity that, of course, has made all the news, then she didn't have to testify about anything anymore because she was given immunity.
So now, as the FBI continues to investigate what was left in the wake of Jeffrey Epstein and his suicide and the arrest of Ghislaine Maxwell, she could be an important witness, I take it.
I think she's an extremely important witness. What she knows, she was in the Epstein compound for many, many years, starting off at 14, if the documents are to be believed. She would have been well acquainted with many, many of the women who have brought complaints against Jeffrey Epstein. She would obviously know Ghislaine Maxwell. And then, of course, the interesting point to me recently, of course, is Ghislaine Maxwell wound up fleeing to sanctuary in New Hampshire, and Nadia Marchenko spent a good deal of her post-Epstein residence in New Hampshire as well. And so that, sort of begs the question of whether there are other people whose names have not yet previously been linked to Epstein who maybe should get some attention, and Nadia Marchenko is the woman to do it. She's got a lot at stake here. She has not been criminally charged for the second time, as Ghislaine Maxwell has been. Will that immunity hold up? Can, politically speaking, anyone bring charges against her, considering the fact that she was so young when she was brought into Jeffrey Epstein's orbit?
You discovered this video in which Nadia appears to be part of a prank on a pilot in California. What's that all about?
Well, I described it in my blog post as being sort of a microcosm of her life. She gets into this acrobatic airplane, and she sits in the back, and the pilot's taking her around. She's dressed like a little girl. She's got pigtails or braids and, sort of this ill-fitting outfit. And they take off, and then halfway through the flight, he says, well, you want to give it a try?
Hey, you want to try one? Okay, you're airplane. Oh!
So she takes over the airplane, and darned if she's not, like a superstar aviator, and she does all her tricks, and he's, so surprised.
What's your attitude at? I'm actually an ATP and an aerobatic pilot.
And then they land, and she rips off the little girl outfit, and there she is, all busty in a tight black dress, and pulls off, when her beautiful blonde hair comes out, and it's like, I'm a sex pot pilot, and that's her whole identity, her whole public identity is that, which you could kind of laugh at if it weren't so tragic, because that's really her, the little girl who was turned into, due to her association with Jeffrey Epstein, turned into an adult woman who believes her only value is as an attractive va-va-boom girl. And that, that's sort of sad. And anyone associated with her who allows her to continue that, I think, does her no service.
And at the end of the day, is there sympathy for her? She was brought into Epstein's circle as a young teenager, became a sex slave, became a victim, now a survivor of this. What happened next? What happened? But do you, in the end, have sympathy for her?
It's a mixed. That's a mixed question. I have sympathy for her, yes, but I find what happens when I write about her, and I've written a lot about her, especially recently with her connection in New Hampshire. I find that people usually come down along the lines of she should rot in hell, she should go to jail. So I find that there's an awful lot of anger foisted at Nadia that really is not foisted on the right entity. She was a victim. If she was also a victimizer, and it looks likely that she was, you must see that in the light of her youth and her own abuse. It's one hand in the other. It's a total package. So yes, I feel sorry for her. I think if she's doing the responsible thing and sort of exposing that larger circle, then she's making amends for whatever role she played in the persecution of other women.
Christine Negroni, thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Thank you.
We reached out to Nadia Marchenko and her lawyer for comment, but so far, no response. Coming up, the race for the vaccine against COVID-19. We'll talk with a top public health official about what the truth is beyond the hype. You're watching the Law and Crime Trial Network. This week, as the COVID-19 pandemic continues, schools are reopening around the world, from London to St. Petersburg to Wuhan, China, where the whole thing started. But in the U.S., it's been a mixed bag as the continued concern about the spread of the virus and, Rhonda, the increasing death toll.
The virus does rage on here in the U.S. with over 6 million cases and since March, 183,000 deaths. The numbers are almost so large, they're almost incomprehensible. And Today, there's new reports that the virus's cases are spiking in the Midwest.
Indeed. Well, joining us to talk about this is Dr. Boris Lushniak. He is the Dean of the University of Maryland School of Public Health and was the acting Surgeon General during a good chunk of the Obama administration. Dr. Lushniak, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me, Brian.
Let me start by asking you, big picture, do you see any bright light at the end of the tunnel?
Well, big picture, we're not exactly where we thought we'd be at this point in time. You know, there had been at least a hope that we would run into a summer lull with COVID-19 and that we would be expecting a surge coming up in the fall and winter. What happened, obviously, was throughout the summertime, we never got to that lull. And we have these sporadic hotspots, as you mentioned, currently in the Midwest. I think South Dakota and Iowa are two of the states most affected right now. But it's really been spreading throughout the United States. And so, therefore, the pandemic sort of moves on unabated.
Last week at the Republican convention, President Trump promised there'd be a vaccine by the end of the year. Take a look at what he said. I want to ask you about what you think of what he had to say.
The entire planet has been struck by a new and powerful, invisible enemy. Like those brave Americans before us, we are meeting this challenge. We are delivering life-saving therapies and will produce a vaccine before the end of the year, or maybe even sooner.
Dr. Lushniak, presidential hype, or is there some truth in that, do you think?
Well, there's a lot of progress being made on the vaccine front. Let's remember that prior to December 31st, 2019, which was why it's an important date because that was the date that the WHO office in China was informed of an outbreak of people with pneumonia due to an unknown cause. So we're now 9 months into this. And in those 9 months, obviously, this has been a novel virus that's been identified, right? And I love using the word novel here because it really is both definitions. Novel is brand new. Our immune system is not used to it. And secondly, novel in that it's been a page turner throughout this whole process. We keep learning brand new things. So incredible progress in that in these short 9 months, we now have 36 different vaccine candidates that are in human clinical trials. Yet, I don't see it happening by the end of the year in terms of having an approved vaccine ready to go. There's still a lot of work to be done ahead of us. Again, a lot of great progress. Right now, we have 9 such vaccine candidates in what's called phase 3 clinical trials, which is now thousands of people getting the vaccine. It's being looked at from the perspective of does it work? Phases 1 and phase 2 of vaccine trials really look at safety measures. Safety measures are still being tabulated here, but at the same time, we are finally at the point of seeing whether things work or not. This has become the new space race globally. We know the Russians have a vaccine that they say is ready to go. We know the Chinese are continuing on their vaccine front, and many other nations are involved. But I don't see it happening by the election, and I don't see it happening by the end of the year. Perhaps early in 2021, will we be at a point where perhaps a vaccine will be proven to work? But at the same time, then we have to get into mass production of that vaccine and mass distribution.
Dr. Lushniak, a question for you from Rhonda Schwartz. Rhonda?
It's the beginning of September, the classic back to school week. In some countries, some cities, schools are reopening, but New York City, due to the virus, has delayed the reopening of schools. What do you say about this? What's your take on this?
Well, Rhonda, again, it's very difficult to say, let's just open up the schools while we still have community spread of the virus going on, right? One of the main features of the spread of this virus is dealing with the density, right, of how many people do we have close together. And I know a lot of the schools are reopening and have taken in the public health recommendations, right? The whole idea of physical distancing, the mask wear, the hand washing, that continues to be very, very important. And yet I'm concerned about this idea of lots of people gathering together. This becomes risky not only for potentially the students themselves, that is spread between students, but certainly to the adults who are teaching in those classes, and then the potential of bringing it back home. So this has to be done very wisely and very carefully. It can't just be a carte blanche that we're opening the schools and we're ready to go.
Doctor, final question for you. Do you see too much of the heavy hand of politics in the decisions being made about this?
Absolutely. You know, the problem from the get-go regarding the national response uh, 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 in fighting COVID-19 and fighting this is disastrous pandemic has been that it's been hyped politically all along. Like, when did it become sort of politics, right, to say whether you're mask wearing or not? I think the major mistake has been that the health communication, the public health communication, began coming from political leadership as opposed to coming from public health leadership. And, you know, politicians need to be involved. They are elected leaders of our society to be able to move us ahead. But the reality is communication needs to be coming from the scientific based side, from the medical based side, from the public health based side. And therefore, I think it's become very confusing for the American public, depending on who's saying what and who they believe in. That shouldn't have happened.
Indeed. Dr. Boris Lushniak from the University of Maryland School of Public Health, thank you so much for being here tonight.
Great. Thank you so much, Brian.
Coming up, this week's winners and losers in the media. See if you agree with what the editors of Mediaite have to say about Laura Ingraham. You're watching the Law and Crime Trial Network. We continue now with this week's winners and losers in the media, as chosen by the editors of Mediaite. And we're joined by Aidan McLaughlin, who's the editor-in-chief of Mediaite, which, like the Law and Crime Trial Network, is part of the Dan Abrams media empire. Aidan, thanks so much for being here. Let's start with your first winner, Caitlin Collins of CNN, who took President Trump to task yesterday at the White House over his support of people considered who are involved in violence.
I have a question on coronavirus, but first, you were just criticizing Joe Biden, saying he didn't mention the far left or Antifa during his speech today. You said you wanted to talk about left-wing political violence. Yeah. But I noticed you did not mention that your supporters were also in Portland this weekend, firing paintball guns at people, some form of pepper spray. So do you want to also take this chance to condemn what your supporters did?
So, Aidan, there's some tough questions there for the president from Caitlin Collins.
Yeah, Caitlin Collins, she's CNN's White House correspondent, and she's well known for questioning Trump from the briefing room. This was a particularly impressive showing from Caitlin Collins. Trump basically held this press conference after Joe Biden had criticized him for his response to the unrest across America. Now, Trump came out and gave a lengthy sort of address where he called out Biden for not explicitly condemning far left protesters and some of the rioting that's occurred across the country. Caitlin Collins brought up the obvious point that, President Donald Trump is asking for Biden to condemn far left protesters, which Biden did do to some extent, perhaps not by name as President Trump would have liked. But there were a lot of Trump supporters that were actually in these cities like Portland. There were videos that went viral of Trump supporters firing paintball guns at protesters and letting out tear gas, not to mention the Trump supporter who ended up allegedly killing 2 people in Kenosha, Wisconsin, who's been charged with 2 murders there. So she was questioning Trump on that sort of, inconsistency in what he was saying from the podium there, and actually went on after President Donald Trump sort of dismissed her question. He said that, that paint are not bullets, to ask about Kyle Rittenhouse, who is the suspected shooter in Kenosha. And Trump moved on to another reporter. She protested, and that other reporter actually asked the question that Caitlin Collins had made. And Trump's answer made a lot of news. So it was a really strong showing from the briefing room. That's kind of why we at Mediaite tune into these sessions, to get this sort of newsworthy moments and information from the president.
And to keep an eye on how reporters are doing. Here's the sort of the exact opposite. His interview yesterday with Fox News anchor Laura Ingraham. Listen to how this went down.
They can do 10,000 great acts, which is what they do, and one bad apple, or a choker. A choker. They choke. Shooting the guy in the back many times. I mean, couldn't you have done something different? Couldn't you have wrestled? In the meantime, he might have been going for a weapon, and, there's a whole big thing there. But they choke. Just like in a golf tournament, They miss a 3-foot.
You're not comparing it to golf because, of course, that's what the media.
I'm saying people choke.
People panic.
Choke.
So it seems Aiden Laura Ingraham is trying to save the president from himself.
Yeah, this was a pretty astonishing interview. You know, I watch a lot of these. President Trump has been on Fox News dozens of times for interviews with the likes of Sean Hannity, and those are typically softball affairs. Laura Ingraham, as we know, she's a primetime host at Fox News. She's a fan of the president. I wasn't expecting to go into this, with tough questions. What was so astonishing about this interview with Trump is that Laura Ingraham repeatedly corrected him, or at least clarified what he was saying in order to rescue him from saying something controversial. That is probably the clip you just played there was probably the most viral of them, when she said, you're not comparing a police shooting to a golfer, choking at a 3-foot putt, which is exactly what he was doing. But there were a few other examples of her basically saying, I hope you're not saying what I think you're saying. At one point he said that, you can't build low-income housing because then crime will go up. She stepped in to say, you're not saying that poor people commit more crime. Of course, that was the implication of what he was saying. He also said that people are controlling Biden from the shadows, which was a sort of weird and vague conspiracy theory. She actually stepped in to say, that sounds like a conspiracy theory. What are you talking about? President Trump proceeded to say, there's these shadowy people in the street that are controlling the street that you don't know about that are controlling Biden, and we're looking into it. It was good that Laura Ingraham asked what he was talking about. After he proceeded to give a pretty nonsensical explanation of what he was talking about, she accepted it and moved on. So those were just 3 times in his one interview where Laura Ingraham had to try and save the president from himself. It was a pretty odd affair, and she's acting more like a PR person than a journalist, frankly.
Absolutely. Well, very important to point that out. Aiden, thanks so much for joining us tonight. And thanks to all of you for joining us, and to our staff at Law&Crime for getting us on the air and off the air.